In 1840, Booker Webster watched as members of the Comanche began wailing in despair. He was a young Texan boy who had been kidnapped by the Comanche a few seasons before. He already understood a fair amount of their language. Several tribal leaders and many other Comanche were killed by the Texans while they met in council. An unspeakable betrayal. The scream of the tribe became louder. He watched as the warriors began to cut their hair. It was sacred to them. The women took knives and sliced themselves on their arms and legs as they cried. They were mourning, but their sadness quickly turned to anger. Booker saw the Comanche begin building fires and preparing their stakes and knives. He was terrified. Other white captives, over a dozen of them, had been gathered for this purpose. Booker was safe. His Comanche mother had adopted him into her family. She loved him and wouldn't let anyone hurt him. But the others, mostly women and children, had a different fate. They were tortured to death. The warriors, the men, had a reputation for the brutality by which they treated their victims. Plains warfare was always a fight to the death, and the rage triggered in a blood feud made violence worse. But this wasn't done by the warriors. These tortures were done by the women. Comanche women were even more cruel than the men. Welcome to Dates and Dead Guys. The life of Comanche women was vastly different than that of the men. In many ways it was harder, at least day to day. They lacked the status of the warriors, but were essential to the survival of the tribal group. Nearly everything done outside of hunting, war, and weapon making in a Comanche camp was the responsibility of the women. They made all of the clothes and blankets, as well as all the tools and housing. It was said that a Comanche woman could set up a teepee in 15 minutes, and when the time called for it, they could take it down and pack it on horseback in 5. As nomads on the Great Plains, they were constantly on the move and ready at a moment's notice. When the men would hunt, it was the job of the women to process the animal. They took on the hard work of tanning the hides and drying the meat, work that was far more intensive when the buffalo hides became more valuable in trade during the 1800s. More work done meant more wealth for successful Comanche men, who often became polygamous. Keeping more wives was a luxury. Comanche women were intensely practical. The long hair so valued by the men held no special meaning to women, so they cut it short. It was more convenient and comfortable, and as both Comanche men and women didn't bathe outside of purification rituals, the short hair was helpful in limiting ticks and lice. They would paint themselves differently from the men too. The men commonly painted their faces black, for war, the color of death. But the women made dyes of brighter colors, like reds and yellows. The Comanche were small by the standards of the time. It is often noted by European observers. Women were commonly under 5 feet tall, and men frequently under 5'6". But the Comanche didn't make their name by being the largest and most powerful. They made their name as warriors on horseback. Although this warfare was conducted by the men, the women were also expert riders and archers. They had to be. Their role in tribal structure wasn't to hunt or fight, but the nature of plains warfare meant they better be able to. When Comanche camps were attacked by Europeans, it was constantly written about that the women would fight just as fiercely as the men. Oftentimes, Texas Rangers or U.S. military wouldn't even try to distinguish between them when they would attack a camp. They fought to the death, to defend themselves and their families from attackers. All members of Plains culture knew what it meant to be defeated or captured by an enemy, so being captured wasn't an option. At best, a person would be subjected to slavery, abuse, and humiliation. But there are worse things. Comanche women knew this. When they would encourage the men to go on raids, they would often return with their own prisoners. And, as in the opening of this video, the women were the ones who dealt out the tortures in camp. Not all captives would be killed. Women and children, like Booker Webster, would sometimes be adopted, but that had its own risks. Boys were often treated well, but the Comanche women would often see girls, especially older ones, as rivals. Establishing the pecking order was cruel. Female captives, if kept alive, were often horribly abused. Two notable examples are Matilda Lockhart and Rachel Plummer. Matilda was captured when she was 14 in late 1838. At that age, for the Comanche, she would be treated as an adult. They would use her as a slave. In 1840, the Panatica Comanche met Texan officials in a meeting in San Antonio. The Comanche were to bring with them, as a sign of good faith, all of their white captives. They brought back Matilda Lockhart. After a year in captivity, she had been mutilated. She was covered in scars, and her nose had been burnt off. The heels of her feet had been burned to keep her from running. All of this had been done by the women. The Comanche thought very little of this. This was normal. It was part of establishing their place in the tribal hierarchy. But the system of hierarchy within the tribe was more open than one might expect. A better example is Rachel Plummer. Rachel was captured in 1836 in the famous raid of Parker Fort in Texas. I detail her capture in another video. If you want to hear that story, I'll link it in the video description. At the time of her capture, Rachel was pregnant. In addition to the tortures of the men, the women beat her regularly. She mentioned later in her memoirs that during her entire duration with the Comanches, she could not remember a time where she wasn't bruised and her skin wasn't raw. Not long after giving birth, the Comanche killed her baby. It was interfering with her work. She was left depressed and hopeless. She was ready to die. One day, she was being harassed by one of the women and was ordered to fetch a tool for digging roots. Rachel refused. In her memoirs, she states, quote, "Having lived as long, and indeed longer than life was desirable, I determined to aggravate them to kill me." End quote. She was hoping to start a conflict serious enough that the Comanche would kill her. At the refusal, the Comanche woman ran at Rachel screaming and pushed her to the ground. The two fought on the ground, biting and scratching. She saw a crowd of men gather in a circle around them. They began whooping and howling as she battled the other woman. At one point in the fight, Rachel was able to get hold of a buffalo bone. She wrote, quote, "I beat her over the head with it, although expecting at every moment to feel a spear reach my heart of one of the Indians. I was determined, if they killed me, to make a cripple of her. Such yells as the Indians made around us, being nearly all collected, a Christian mind cannot conceive. No one touched me. I had her past hurting me, and indeed nearly past breathing when she cried out for mercy." End quote. As Rachel stood with a bloody buffalo bone over the Comanche woman, she couldn't believe that she wasn't dead. Why didn't the Comanche men kill her? They didn't even take her away from the woman. When the fight was over, the men just dispersed. They didn't even seem to care. But the fighting wasn't over. An older woman in the tribe then tried to establish herself over Rachel. Insulted by her fight with the other woman, she ordered Rachel to gather straw so that she could be burned to death. Now, having decided that she wanted to live, Rachel again refused. The old Comanche woman started to fire, and then the two fought viciously. At one point, both of them were badly burned as the woman tried to force Rachel into it. Again, the men watched, amused, but they did nothing to stop them. As they continued to fight, they broke a lodgepole of one of the teepees. Rachel again won, and was summoned to the council house of the men the next morning. She expected some sort of punishment, but the chiefs asked only that Rachel repair the lodgepole of the teepee that she had broken in the fight. She agreed, so long as the old woman was to help her. She was baffled by the whole affair. What Rachel didn't understand was the custom of hierarchy among women in the tribe. The men mostly ignored this aspect of the culture as the women were concerned, allowing it to play out as it would naturally. Sometimes the fights even changed things for the better. It let people know where they stood. For Rachel, after her first fight, she actually washed the face of the woman who she had beaten. She said that from that time forward, the woman was remarkably friendly. There is a part of that I think a lot of people understand. This custom set boundaries and determined how women of the tribe would treat each other. But let me know in the comments. Have you ever had a fight that changed your relationship with someone for the better? But Rachel's situation with the tribe was different than some others. She was a slave, kept for labor, who would eventually be ransomed. She had value to the tribe. Not every captive did, and the women treated them far worse. In 1840, Texan soldiers attacked and killed dozens of Panatica Comanche at a meeting between the two parties. Violence broke out because the Texans took the Comanche chiefs prisoner after they failed to bring with them to the meeting the white captives demanded by the Texans. The surviving Comanche viewed this event, the council house fight, as a betrayal beyond comprehension. Upon learning of the deaths of the chiefs, the distraught warriors would cut off sections of their long sacred hair. But the women would express their despair more disturbingly. Comanche women would enter into their custom of mourning rites. They would wail and cut themselves on their arms, legs, and breasts. Booker Webster, the young boy captive who witnessed the event, claimed that some would chop off their fingers, and others were injured so severely that they died. After they were done doing damage to themselves, they looked to the prisoners that the Texans wanted returned, and they decided it was time for revenge. As the Comanche men gathered to form a war party against the Texans, the women were left with the job of dispatching the white captives. The women tortured them to death, adult and child, one by one. They would mutilate them, cutting and skinning them before burning them to death in the fire. For some, it took hours. For others, days. To them, this was normal. Mutilation of the enemy was common practice on the plains. It meant that you would be damaged going into the afterlife. To the Comanche, their true tribal name was the Numina. It meant the people. Anyone else didn't qualify. They would have expected the same to happen to them under similar circumstances. The Comanche men were brutal on the warpath, but in their attack and retreat they acted quickly. In the camp, the women had the time to enact their will upon their enemies. They enjoyed it and took trophies, just as the Comanche men did. For decades, settlers on the frontier knew that if they were captured and survived to the camp, things were not going to get better. Hard to imagine something more terrifying.